Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extended respect to all First Nations peoples who are here in the audience today. I recognise that Indigenous people have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for over 65,000 years, and are our first educators and acknowledge the place of Indigenous knowledges in the academy. We now moved into autumn, or also into what's called euk, or eel season. And in fact, eels continue to swim through the waterways of the university. They even pop up from time to time in some of the ponds and stormwater gates that exist here on the Parkville campus. The Faculty of Education acknowledges these waterways through artworks that adorn the Leicester Street and Queensbury entrances by Indigenous artist James Henry. As the days get shorter and the academic years gather momentum, we are reminded that learning is shaped by place, by season, and by the enduring custodianship of this land. So welcome to the very first Dean's Lecture in 2026 series. Tēnā koutou, ko Marek Tesar tōku ingoa. My name is Marek Tesar, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Melbourne. Tonight's Dean's Lecture has gathered a great deal of interest, and I would like to welcome all our guests here tonight. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker and a great academic friend of this university, I would like to acknowledge and thank in advance Professor Liz McKinley, Deputy Dean of Education, for facilitating an audience Q&A following the presentation and delivering tonight's vote of thanks. Thank you, Liz. I would like to also acknowledge and thank our distinguished guests who are here, some of them in the front row. Distinguished Professor Graham Smith, companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit, and happy birthday, Graham. Together with Linda, delivered yesterday a very special session for our faculty and for our staff, with Professors Jessa Rogers and Nikki Moody responding to that talk. Thank you, Graham, for being here tonight. We have also Professor Barry Judd, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous, here in the audience. And we have Redmond Berry Distinguished Laureate Professor Marcia Langton here with us today, Associate Provost and Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies here at the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Marcia, and thank you for supporting our faculty. Thank you all for supporting our academia, and thank you so much for supporting the Faculty of Education and coming here tonight to join us for this very special Dean's Lecture. Tonight we are all here to listen to a much anticipated presentation from distinguished Professor Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who continues to enjoy a renowned and impactful career. On a very personal note, as someone from Aotearoa, New Zealand, Linda, is so special to welcome you here to the land of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. The last time we met was about 2 years ago at the marae of the Waipapa Taumata Rao in Tamaki Makaurau, and where you delivered an amazing keynote to the Philosophy of Education conference that we organized. And I will speak for all Kiwis here at the audience and at the faculty. Your scholarship and work has shaped generations of Indigenous and Pākehā scholars. And I cannot emphasize enough how much we have learned from you and how immensely we are proud of you and how much impact your work made in Aotearoa and in the world. Kia ora, Linda, and of course, kia ora, Graham, for your work, for your mahi. So now back to the script. So Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith is a distinguished professor at Te Whare Wānanga o Awanuitiarangi in Whakatane, New Zealand. She's Indigenous Maori and from Ngāti Awa, Ngāti Porou, and Tuhiwai tribes. Linda is known internationally for her work on decolonising research methodologies, Indigenous education, and kaupapa Māori. She was the co-founding co-director of Ngāpai o Te Māramatanga, the Maori Centre of Research Excellence, and has held several senior academic roles at the University of Auckland and the University of Waikato Linda has served on the Health Research Council, the Marsden Fund Council, the Royal Society of New Zealand Council, and is currently Deputy Chair of the Council of Te Wharewananga o Awanui Tarangi. She is a Fellow of the American Education Research Association, a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, an international member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the US National Academy of Science, and the US National Academy of Education. Linda was awarded a Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to Maori and education in 2013. Her influential book that many of us know and read and reread and read all together in various reading groups is called Decolonising Methodologies, Research on Indigenous Peoples, first published in 1999, some 27 years ago, and is considered a seminal text in Indigenous studies and critical research methodologies. Absolutely must read, and something that is true taonga, a true gift that we have received from you, Linda. Other notable publications include the International Handbook of Indigenous Education that was co-edited with our own Professor Liz McKinley back in 2017, and A Civilized Mission, The Making of New Zealand's Native School System, 1897 to 1969, published in 2001. Linda has recently published also 5 children's picture books inspired by her research on Maori strategies for healing from trauma. So please join me in welcoming distinguished Professor Linda Tuhiwai Smith to the stage for her Dean's lecture. Thank you.
Mo tuatahi, he mihi, ki te whenua nei, ki te tangata whenua, ki ngā tīpuna mai o mua, ki muri, kia koutou ko tai mai I tēnei ahiahi, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings, everyone. Greetings first to the lands that we're on. Acknowledge the peoples of this land, of this country. Acknowledge ancestors, past, present, emerging, and the future. I want to thank the Dean and the Faculty of Education who have me here today. I always wonder why I say yes to these things. I want to acknowledge Marcia, the Indigenous faculty who are here. I have been coming to Melbourne for quite a few years, and every time I see a new Indigenous faculty member, I think, oh, okay, things are growing. And I know that's because there's some very special Indigenous leadership in this place. Colleagues, friends, people I've yet to be friends with, thank you for coming. Yeah, why did I say yes? Probably because there was something bugging me about the current state of education in New Zealand. But that's not what I'm talking about. So my title is Teaching Sovereignty, Indigenous Education in Crisis Times. It's kind of interesting to even talk about sovereignty, which Indigenous people have been talking about for a long time, right? In a world where current sovereignties are being attacked, where the whole idea of sovereignty, of self-determination, which is an idea of liberalism in a sense, an idea that's come out of Europe, an idea that was stable after World War II that has become very unstable in the last few years. But as I said, Indigenous peoples have been struggling for sovereignty and for self-determination for decades. And when I use the word sovereignty or use the word self-determination, those words are not the words of our language. they're the words that we use to negotiate a space to talk about what our aspirations are. They are not perfect words for us. They don't quite get at what we're trying to achieve. So we're always trapped in this sort of default terminology. We use it to communicate. And then we turn around and we have to translate it into our own language at home. We prefer words like mana motuhake, to have mana in our own whenua, to have tino rangatiratanga. Those are terms our people understand and relate to. So the whole, I guess, thinking about sovereignty and its origins and the idea of a sovereign and the idea of supreme authority of a state to govern itself is at odds with the experience of Indigenous peoples who have been invaded by the ones who created a state. And the right to govern ourselves was removed from us, was taken from us. And so the desire remains for us to have governance over ourselves. And actually, yeah, we want to have governance over you as well. So in this talk, really I want to go back in a way to my own beginnings as a little baby. No, I'm not going back there. But I want to go back really to the beginning of my career. Firstly, my career as a teacher, but before I do that, my career growing up in small Māori communities. So for the first part of my life, really until I started an intermediate school in Auckland when I was 11, my life was in small communities. And over COVID, Graham and I moved back to his community. So I've kind of gone full circle back to a small community. And I love it. But it's made me think about the amazing things that our communities do. Doesn't matter what discourse is going on. When people are depressed about what the government is doing, when I look at our communities, I'm inspired. I'm inspired by what they do. I'm inspired by what they do even when they don't have the resources to do those things well. On the left, that's the first school I went to. That's the girls. There were about the same amount of boys. And we were the softball team, the netball team, the rugby team. And my dad was the headmaster and my mother was the infant mistress. Minginui Forest School, it was in the bush, literally in the central North Island in the Uruwera forest. It was a forest school before such things became created. And on the right is the second school I went to. And once again, my dad was the principal. The difference between the two schools are structural differences, not just size. The first school was a native school, classified as a Māori school, under legislation that created these schools in 1867. Those schools were created before the Education Act that created compulsory schooling. Those schools were created along with a raft of legislation aimed at removing our people from our land, aimed at individualising land title, aimed at civilising and assimilating us. So the school on the left, by the time I was going to school, most of the teachers were Māori teachers. They were trained teachers, but the schools had become quite embedded in our communities. The committees, school committees, were all Māori. The teachers were mostly all Māori, although we had a country service provision. All teachers had to do country service in order to proceed in their careers. Those schools were assimilated into the mainstream in 1969. So that's 100 years of a separate school system. The school on the right is a board or Department of Education school. But you can see from the students that most of them were also Māori. In the school on the left, basically, that was still in my tribal region. The school on the right was in another tribal region that we had to kind of navigate and get used to. This is my first class as a year one teacher. They pretty much taught me all I needed to know to survive a year, right, as a first year teacher. They're 11 years old, had a Welsh principal who loved poetry. So this is in South Auckland, urban, rapid growing community. The students, all of them had come either from the country, rural areas in New Zealand, or from the Pacific Islands. None of them spoke a kind of reasonable standard New Zealand English, right? Even though Māori students coming from the country region spoke their kind of English. And then, of course, the Pacific Island students often had little English. It was an era when I was trained as a teacher, so I'm talking about the 1970s, early 1970s, when compensatory education was the kind of dominant mode of thinking about schooling for what we might call diversity now. So the compensatory model, you would recognise, if I call it a deficit-based approach to education. It was based on the idea that Māori students, Pacific Island students, students who are from like urban area, any students who didn't kind of fit this narrow sense of who was normal in our own country, had deficits, that they were coming to school with no knowledge or irrelevant knowledge, that the language they were bringing was insufficient for development, and they were coming with basically nothing. They had nothing to contribute to the classroom. And the role of a teacher then was to compensate for all those deficits. And in other words, I mean, you know, Freire used the concept of the banking model. But the compensatory model was also a very dangerous model if you took it seriously, because it was a model that genuinely dismissed everything a child learned at home, right? All their culture, the values that they brought from home were seen as irrelevant to their development and something that schools had to get rid of, right? So it wasn't just we had to compensate, we had to get rid of all those bad habits from the student. So I got trained under that model. And the reason I kind of returned to it is we've got a government that's gone back to that model. They might use a different language, but the philosophy driving what they're talking about is the same philosophy. Like right now in New Zealand, we have a government who are very dismissive of Indigenous knowledge, who are trying to reshape a curriculum to give knowledge, like the right knowledge, to students. They're trying to develop a core set of readings, for example, that excludes most New Zealand authors, writers. I think we get a couple, and I think there are only 2 Māori authors on that list. So it's an erasure of really everything that's been developed over the last 40, 50 years in education. Okay, so in these pictures are just places I've been and groups that I've worked with since January. Yeah, or the end of last year. So on the left, a Decolonial Summer Institute in Pretoria, in South Africa, at the University of South Africa. On the right is a cohort of doctoral students at my institution who come in for a residential study week. On the right here, the purple shed is where I've just been in Alice Springs, and that's a community research workshop. In the middle is a teacher development day in Wanganui, where I live, and what the schools and teachers did is they combined their teacher-only day days and agreed to have one event and to focus on Māori education. And because it's not all about big groups, on the left is a group of young mothers that I've been working with over the last 3 years in research to do with food sovereignty. So I want to talk a little bit now about the task of teaching. And what do I mean by teaching? So yes, I mean educating, mentoring, communicating, training, nurturing, modelling, rehearsing, performing, practicing, questioning, problem posing, developing critical thinking, leading, doing admin, a lot of admin. But I also mean teaching as acts of love, as acts of compassion, as acts of recognition. I mean teaching as healing from historical and intergenerational trauma. I mean teaching as acknowledgement of people, that they exist, of our iwi, our tribes, that they are real, of communities, that they exist, of reclaiming knowledge. I think it's also about teaching activism, kinds of activism that our students in time will need to act for sovereignty. That it's also about languaging, not the language of, framed by compensatory education, no sort of rich language, but the language that names our experience, the language that names our aspirations, the language that makes things like racism real to them, that it's more than just a single word, that there's whole vocabulary of racism they need to understand. And that vocabulary nails many of the experiences that they have in society. I think teaching is also a creative activity, that it is about creativity. It's about creating a world that this generation of young people will go into, but they will create their own world as well. It's also about reciprocity. The teacher does not know everything. The students bring a wealth of language, knowledge and experience and insight. And all of you who've taught people know, even the littlest ones, that they have a view of the world and they have a way of languaging that. And they can pull you up with a surprise in the way they express that. I think it's about, for us, about our ancestral knowledge and having a place in the learning experience. It's always relational teaching, all right? It's always about being in relation to. The difficulty with, models where the teacher is the authority is that kind of relationship is a very stark relationship of power. It's a power relation. And I think one of the challenges in the spaces I work in is how do you ensure that power is distributed in the classrooms, in the worlds and in the relationships that we build. It is always intergenerational, and I'll give you some examples of that shortly. But I guess what is the purpose of teaching? What is the purpose of education if we're thinking about sovereignty? I think from an Indigenous perspective, we want education to deliver sovereignty. And in order to do that, we have to teach our young people to believe they belong to a sovereign nation. It has been built into the practice of teaching. How do you practice sovereignty with 5-year-olds? Well, I know with my grandson, even before he was 5, was asserting his tino rangatiratanga. All right, he was asserting a sort of concept of sovereignty in a whole series of acts in which I eventually had to pull him up and tell him to apologise. and he said, "No, Nanny, I have rangatiratanga." And I said, "Not in my house, you don't. Go and tidy up." Right, so let me just get through some of these acts of teaching. I think one of the responsibilities of our teachers has always been to understand the impact of colonisation, the huge impact on our world. And I love this map, right, that master is saying the world, because can you see Aotearoa on that map? I mean, I can't think of a starker way of saying we don't exist, right, in a classroom context, if you're not on the map. And I've actually been in a classroom in the US. I went to secondary school in the US. And where New Zealand was a big cloud which said map of the world. And Australia was on the map, but the whole of New Zealand was a cloud called the map of the world. And when the teacher asked me, we've got a visitor from overseas, please come and point on the map where you're from. I had to point at the map of the world. But to be constantly erased is what early colonial schooling did, right? And it did it in very explicit ways. And it did it not just with grand policies and ideologies about the purpose of education. I was always shocked when I went into, the Hansard's parliamentary debates and some of the archives about how petty the actual rules were for ensuring our people were culturally assimilated. For example, the design of school desks. Right, in the early days, they had, one structure which was a desk, 2 children sat at that desk. It's very solid, very wooden. But the policy about the desk was to ensure that young children kept in their space, they were disciplined into that space, and they didn't wander over into the other space. It was about ensuring that they were little individuals with their learning. It was basically a furniture of discipline and control, very explicitly so. And that really led, I guess, to some of my early research with Judith Simon and Graham, Stuart McNaughton, and other colleagues on the native school system. The native school system has been blamed for a number of things. One is the absolute destruction of our language, that one of the policies of the Department of Education was to ensure that Māori language was not the language of school, language of schooling. And so there are many generations who speak about schools as being very abusive places. They were hit, they were punished for speaking Māori language, and many of them just didn't go to school because it was so traumatic for them in terms of language. But in the very early part of schooling, that didn't happen. I think one of the maybe unique parts of the New Zealand school system is for teachers to survive in a community, they either had to speak Māori language or die, because they were the only English speaker. And so they had to navigate a world and learn, at least for many of them became very fluent in Māori language in those early days when Māori could not speak English. But the moment there was sufficient English speakers in the community, then that policy changed. This on the left is a collection a group of colleagues have done to assemble Māori contributions to literature. Professor Jacinta Ruru at University of Otago. And they started out trying to identify our earliest writers and the contribution to scholarship about our world that Māori were performing and producing in the late 19th century all the way through the 20th century. And that collection is growing. One of the key figures, who's probably one of the most published ones on the left, is my father, who was a professor of Māori studies at Victoria University and who founded the institution that I now teach at. And recently, he's 99. Last year, he published a book on Māori knowledge. And then last week, we republished a book, which was his master's thesis, on Māori traditional clothing. And those were some of the books there. But it was kind of one of those circular moments as well, because we invited everyone who came to the book launch to dress Māori, all right? To dress Māori. And so people came in their regalias, their beautiful cloaks, but they also came with their political T-shirts, the Tino Rangatiratanga flag, and it was this kind of story of the way our clothing has kind of survived over time and has actually become very fashionable. So if you go to a protest now, you actually have to dress up. It's a bit embarrassing for some of us, who think, and I'll tell you what shortly. So part of teaching is really, let me just go back here, is what are the resources we teach from? All right, so we've got to teach from our resources. And while we can say, yes, we're an oral culture, we have a tradition of writing now. And in the same way I might talk to students about citation practices, we have to talk to teachers about the resources that they reference in their classrooms. How do they build their curriculum? Whose knowledge do they go to? Whose authors do they use in classrooms to develop their resources? Also, as I said earlier, part of a role of a teacher is to help a community heal. We have so much trauma in our communities, it's not funny. And at any one given moment, it's at play. All right, it's there, alive, in a classroom, in an interaction, in a community, in a group. And teachers who don't recognise that that's needing some intervention will simply treat it as a behavioural problem or a mental health issue, you know, and we put it nicely into a little box. Not something that's much deeper and is much more collective. I've taught and visited places in pretty much all around the world, actually, and you get a sense when you walk into a space that something is there. You can't see it, you can't voice it, you don't know what it is, but it is present in the people you work with. That's true also in our classrooms, that there's often a deep trauma there that's unstated, unspoken, undiagnosed, and teachers really don't have the tools to work with that and to move into really a healing space. Now, some of you will know there's a whole literature on trauma-informed care, and on the left was a book a colleague, Leonie Pihammer, and I did about, we started out researching trauma-informed care, but in interacting with our community providers, all of whom got funding to do trauma-informed care, none of them were doing trauma-informed care, all of them said they were doing healing. That the focus of the program was not this kind of it's actually the whole idea of trauma-informed care to me is very sort of neoliberal idea, and you fix them up, you have 4 sessions, give them a bandage, they're fixed. You can't do that with historical intergenerational trauma. It is a long-term process of healing. And those are 4 of the children's books I wrote. One of the things as a researcher, when you're researching in the space of trauma, is you hear things, you feel things, you observe things, and academic writing really is not the best way to communicate that, right? It's very hard to communicate pain or love or joy in that kind of writing. But one of the things I sort of noticed in this work, and it comes, I guess, a little bit, I do have a background. I was sent to University of Auckland to train as a counsellor. I hated it. But I did my 1,000 hours, and I did my diploma, but I converted it all to a Masters of Education and got to do the PhD bit. But no one writes about stuff that happens that young people witness or experience directly to children. No one writes to them. You go and look in the library. Writes about them. It writes about them to adults, but not directly for them to read. And so those were some of the books, and they deal with things like suicide of a sibling, a long-term illness and death of a parent, actual child abuse, and they tell a story of healing a year after whatever the event is. And I think what I wanted to show is our children don't need therapists necessarily for all this. They need adults who are honest adults who love them, adults who communicate, and adults who are creative, right? Who are creative, who can work out ways to resolve things. And those adults aren't just in the home. They're in the wider family, they're in the peer group, they're in the school, and they're in the community. And it takes that whole village to help in the healing process. So a role now of teachers in our system is actually to honour the activists who've gone before us. And we've had generations of activism, but the generation I've been part of was an activist group called Ngā Tamatoa. And I think what I always want to remind my students of is when we were activists, we were like 19. We were 20, we were 21-year-olds. Eh, Marcia? We were young. And it wasn't that we were full of rage, we were full of hope. We were full of optimism. We believed we could change the world. Even though not only was the whole world against us, our own people were against us. Our communities were against us. Right? They were like ashamed of us. Told us all sorts of horrible things, booted us off our own marae. They were not nice. Now everyone claims they were like related to us or in our group. But actually our groups, Ngā Tamatoa was very small. The membership was a very small group. But I guess what we learned is how to mobilise thousands. And our focus at the time was about honouring our treaty, having our language taught in schools, and removing racism. Those goals haven't really changed. On the right are some of us who are still alive, right? Many of our activists are not. And we're all old. We're in our 70s and 80s. And that goes not just for the group I was in, but for that generation of activism. So one of the projects that I've been part of is really just honouring the stories of our activists, particularly our women, right? Because there's a couple of documentaries have been made about these groups, and they mostly feature the men. I mean, the men made most of the, they're the images that you mostly see in the newspapers. They're the ones the photographers took photos of. But those of us in the group who are the women, we claim we were the strategists and we did the logistics. There's no way that those men could have been there without us. Hana, on the left, was the woman who led the Māori language petition. And this wall painting, it's huge, has been painted in her hometown of New Plymouth. And it's a painting just to honour her story as an activist, but as the one who led this huge petition. And the reason it's important is as we tell our stories over time, we start, if we're not telling them ourselves, those stories start to take a different kind of life course. Sometimes that life course is actually wrong, totally, but sometimes it puts the emphasis on the wrong people. It likes to create heroes, not heroines, but also likes the idea of heroes, and if you had to have some, heroines, not recognising that these groups operate as collectives. And that, you know, what you saw in public was not the whole of the group. On the right, that's Graham, but this picture's not about him. He's just getting in the way, actually. took recently, but there's a photo of his mum, who passed a few years back. But she was an activist and a feisty protester and, really staunch in her actions and in the way she loved and cared for other people. And so even recently we honoured I think we're up to 31 years of this particular protest that we went to. Even after all that time, the people honour her and the others who participated in that. People were arrested and people were beaten up and all that kind of thing. And my mother-in-law is probably, or was, little here. But you'd be afraid of her. Yeah, if she was wild. So just kind of honouring those stories, but also telling those stories. Ngā Tamatoa, the group I was in, we haven't told our story, and we talk about telling our story all the time. So we've had reunions, and we go, we need to write a book, and then, of course, we don't write a book. And then we moan about someone who's trying to write a book. But a lot of that comes back to me saying that we were young. None of us documented what we did. It was pre-cell phone, pre-internet. None of us took photos of what we did. And we argued a lot, all right? And we still do, right? We don't agree on the book. Well, we kind of agree on the book, but not the shape of the book. And typically, it's the women who are going to do the work to do the book, but the men want the last say. So we're at a standoff. But also the other thing is we don't want to tell this sort of boring story of an activist group, the public story of the activist group. Because actually the behind-the-scenes story is what we remember most. It was a big part of our lives, about growing up, having fights, not getting on with each other, pulling something off spectacularly, without much planning, having fun, all of those things, and meeting amazing people along the way. I mean, in the end, we got a lot of support, but not from our parents' generation. Our support came from elders, completely supportive. All right, so here's another kind of activism, and I think, Marcy, you were part of the sort of scene as well, the sort of international work that our activists did across a range of topics, not just the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but there was a sway of international, global work that our activists were doing. And on the left is my sister Aroha. She was one of the Māori who was in the drafting of the Declaration, but she also led the development of what's called the Mātātua Declaration on the cultural and intellectual property rights of Indigenous peoples, which she did 32 years ago. So now we're thinking about IP all the time, right? This was ahead of its time as a document, and if you go into the UN system, it sits in the UN system. It was taken around the world and is part of a suite of declarations that Indigenous groups, Indigenous activists were making, at that time, 30 years ago. And this is an event we held really to celebrate the 30th anniversary. Those are the signatories to it. She's kept all the records, but yeah. If we don't tell that story, it's an unknown story. On the left is one of the first kura kaupapa Māori that we established. We meaning Graham, I, and a group of parents. And so, you know, as I said, no cell phones at that time to take cool pictures. That could have been a Polaroid. But that generation are here on the right. Right, and this is an event where they were taking the crown to the Waitangi Tribunal because of breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi in terms of the treatment of kura kaupapa Māori. So the leading young advocates in this process are graduates from that era. So this is, when I'm talking about intergenerational work, you know, this is just another example of it. The one on the left, Aureni, she was quite well known as the first newsreader who had a full moko kauai, but also there is the next one has a PhD in education. The next one is a well-known filmmaker, and the two on the right are also. So it's a remarkable generation, but starting from something small, all right, from a community who are prepared to make a sacrifice. This is a different kind of community. So you don't have to be a teacher to teach. Sometimes you're trained to teach, but it untrains you to teach. You have to relearn to teach when you're back in communities, to teach the way they want to be taught. So on the left, those are actually all elders from Graham's family who meet regularly to share information about health. We have a terrible health system. There's no information flows that come to our communities who live in remote areas. So once a month, this group gets together and demands that someone comes and talks to them. Could be about heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, whatever people need. And on the right is food, which is central to most of our teaching and learning, but it is also some visitors that we had from the US at the doctoral support program that we run in Wanganui. So we've had a doctoral program known as the MAI since about the year 1999 or year 2000. And Graham suggested at that time that we could develop 500 Māori to do their PhDs in 5 years. Didn't quite work out in 5 years, but I think we got it in like 7 years. But it became a core part of the Centre of Research Excellence that we were funded for and I was co-director of. So now we have my groups and doctoral support groups across the country. We're not interested in institutions. We're interested in our people. And we're interested in them being supported in our communities while they did their studies. And so once a month, this is a writing group who come. It's not just ones doing doctoral studies. Anyone in the community who's writing can join this group. It's got no fancy structure. It's all voluntary. Everyone brings food and they write in a small town. All right. Now, Hana Rāwhiti, our youngest member of parliament. This image, I think, went viral around the world. She is from that language nest and that kura kaupapa Māori generation as well. And I guess what I'm trying to say is everything that I'm illustrating here is an example of teaching for sovereignty. But it takes many pathways. And sometimes you think, people are cynical about why engage in the system, why vote. why participate? And especially why participate when we're constantly the minority. We have a record of having Māori members of Parliament. Was structured into the creation of the New Zealand Parliament. There were traditionally 4 members, north, south, east, west, but we've changed into a multi-proportional representation system, and we still have those 4 seats. They've grown to 7, but we also have a political party called the Māori Party that contests those seats and others, and Hana Rāwhiti is one of those members of Parliament. So we also have kind of a huge revitalisation program, not just of language, because what the revitalisation of language has done is unleashed this wide, diverse revitalisation of cultural practices. And this is my daughter getting her moko kauai. So she's lying down there while the artist begins the process, supported by her cousins and sisters family. And then on the right is just after it was completed, and that's her big cousin with her. So, you know, there's this decision to be Māori, this decision to claim identity on your skin, because when it's on your skin, it marks you, right? And so it's a very deliberate step for many of our young people on this journey of their vision of what sovereignty or mana motuhake might look like to them. So some of you might recognise this woman. I met her in Alice Springs, Raylene Brown, who's an awesome expert in bush food. And she's teaching us. But she teaches all over Australia. I think she was on MasterChef as an Indigenous food expert. And the practice of food is something I've become very interested in my current research around food sovereignty, or kai sovereignty we call it, not just eating food, I mean we like that, but the restoration of our systems around food, their reciprocity systems. It's an economic system. It's a system that links say inland tribes to coastal tribes, because if you're an inland tribe and you desire seafood, you have no rights to get it unless a coastal tribe gives you those rights or give you the food. So it's a huge economic chain, if you like, around food. And we started to see a glimpse of it during COVID, when everything got locked down, as our community started to practice this older form of distributing food. Who had food to share? How did you get it to our elders, to our vulnerable families? And they started to rebuild that system. But it is also about being able to read the environment we're in and understand what our food is. What I loved about Raylene, she's part of a bigger group across the world of Indigenous food experts, is really the issue around protecting the intellectual property of Indigenous food, because already, you know, she gave examples of bush food that's now multi-million-dollar product, but with very little benefit coming back to the women who are harvesting it or the women who are doing the work. And in a sense, intellectual property is gone as it's moved into sort of out of the hands of Indigenous peoples. So this is my dad, another mode of teaching, very traditional mode actually, of a great-grandfather teaching his great-grandson how to garden. It's really funny. Rāniera, my grandnephew, is now 4. He's an expert in the garden, he thinks. His father, who was very reluctant he's a hunter, but he was very reluctant to learn gardening. He now this summer had the biggest garden ever between him and my dad, and now I have to ask for permission to get a watermelon because they own it. This is Moana. I went to visit her potato farm that she and her husband have grown. Now, Moana was part of the Atlantic Fellows program here in Melbourne, and an impressive operation of growing this. It's a tiny, purpley covered potato, but it's a delicacy for us. And not only is she growing lots of potatoes, but her husband's very innovative, and he's moving into things like gin, making gin, thinking about all the byproducts for all the, the little potatoes that you see there that no one really wants to eat. So they've got quite a big operation in the north. So eating our food, to me, is a practice of decolonising, right? But to eat our food, you have to know where to gather our food. So gathering our food is a practice of decolonising, harvesting our food, looking after the environment in which our food grows. That also is an act of decolonising. So anyone in our culture, the word for a teacher is a kaiako, a feeder of learning. And a student is seen as also a teacher, and a teacher is also a learner. So when we think of this relationship of a teacher and a learner, they're just two sides of the process of learning. And on the left, there's 2 young people who have helped write a book about the story of their river, and they're explaining that to a big audience. But here on the right, there are 4 people here who are the head cooks at a marae, 4 different marae. Now, when you're the head cook at our marae, you're the one who is in charge of all the hospitality for feeding manuhiri or guests who come for a big event. Now, if it's a tangihanga, like a funeral, can take 3 days, they're in charge of feeding all the guests who come. And it starts with breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, supper. That's the basic structure. But visitors come all times. So the morning tea is many morning teas. The lunch is an extended lunch. So these people are very powerful in that they're in charge of the kitchen. And none of them really wanted that job. But the marae needed a cook. And they were the ones who learned it growing up, but also put their hands up to do that. And they were incredibly funny, talking about, what it takes to sustain a kitchen. And some of our big marae, when I'm talking about guests, I'm talking about 5,000 people come in for lunch, all right? Or a wedding. A wedding can be 2,000 people. A tangihanga can be, it can start out with maybe 50 people, and then 300 people arrive tomorrow. So the whole catering thing is very intuitive, but you need to get food. Where do you get food from? And that was the question that they were all talking about. They get food through relationships. They get food because a family has always provided 2 beef, all right, 2 whole beef. That's their contribution. They've done it for decades. So when there's a tangi or a hui at the marae, the cook rings that family and asks, can we have 2 beef? Another family might provide avocados, all right? So it's all done in this relational way. It's really magical, but also scary. I'd hate to be the cook. But they're big, all right, so the big worry that they have is the grocery bill now is going up. So what that's a sign of is the contribution is going down. Whereas before, the actual, what you had to go and buy at the supermarket was just your basics, flour, sugar, tea, coffee. But with the grocery bill going up, that's showing our system is collapsing a bit. Nearly finished. All right, so what are the stories we need right now in a time of crisis? So this is my colleague, Leonie, who I work with. This is another group that we were doing some strategic planning with. I think, you know, Indigenous peoples have lived in crisis since colonisation arrived. We know how to live in crisis. The question I always ask is, can we live in a world, can we imagine a world in which we're not in crisis? Can we imagine that world where we have a kind of sovereignty that we have aspired to? How do we teach for that world? Not how do we teach to survive in crisis, because I think we're pretty good at doing that. We're pretty resilient. But how do we teach for a world in which our dreams come true? What are the things that we need to prepare for that world? Because I firmly believe we can teach for a world that we're only just imagining. And the reason I believe that is because that's what our language nest has shown us, that we can create a school that can help us save a language. But we did not know when we started our schooling what a generation who could speak Māori language might be, what kind of people they'd be, what kind of world they would want to create. But now we've got that 30-year, 40-year span, we can see, oh, wow, right? The role of education is about the future and about preparing for the future. And so, to me, the message really is we can teach for a world in which we're sovereign as Indigenous peoples. And the challenge is, let's get on with it. Kia ora.
I've known Linda for over 30 years. She does this on purpose. I was going to invite some questions from the audience, but she just went on, right? So we're running over time, but I have a question for the audience. Now, don't be shy. How many of you bought your book to be signed? Have we only got one? You know, oh, maybe a few. Yeah, don't be shy, right? So make a queue here at the end, and she will sign your book. The last time Linda spoke here, she had a huge queue that went up, and everybody had bought their book. So I just want to take a little bit of time to thank Linda to come. I was in the right place at the right time. I heard via the grapevine that Linda was coming to Alice Springs to work with Lowitja, and I said to her, you can't get from New Zealand to Alice Springs without stopping somewhere. Why don't you make it Melbourne, I said. Come to Melbourne and maybe you could just put in a Dean's lecture at the same time. And she graciously said yes. But Linda, I just want to say that lecture, there were just so many things that we could talk about in terms of that talk that you just gave. But I think from my point of view, one of the things I took away from it, or have taken away from it, is to take a saying we have at home. Some of you might have recognised, I'm a Kiwi as well, but take the saying that we have at home, ka mua ka muri. Yeah, walking backwards into our future. And one of the things that I've taken that you've reminded us of is the grounding of community and the grounding of knowledge that we have had that has been erased, as you said yourself, right? That it's been erased over time, and that it is time that we revisited that knowledge. And that's what I mean by walking into the future, looking back. Yeah, that we bring that knowledge with us. We are not ashamed of that knowledge. It is our knowledge, and we have been taught to be ashamed of it in some ways, of that knowledge. And I know the great work that you're doing with those young mothers and introducing their babies to foods that we used to eat that we've forgotten about, instead of going down to the supermarket and getting something that's packaged. But growing our kai in the garden, and eating some of those more traditional things, like gathering puha out of the gardens, which grows quite wild. For those of you not sure, it's a type of dandelion, if you like, if you're a sciencey person. But it's puha that just grows as a weed, right? That it wasn't any good, and yet I know that it's everybody's boil up as much as anywhere else, and I'm sure there's people in the audience that have puha in their garden and put it in their puhas, put it in their boil up. So I just want to say thank you, Linda. Really thank you for coming and saying yes. We're really pleased that you said yes, and I just want to say also with Graham, coming to Graham, Linda and Graham did a panel with us yesterday that was really great, very provocative, and gave us lots of things to talk about, and have also worked with our early career researchers, with our Indigenous staff here in the faculty and across the university. So I want to thank you a lot, tremendously, for the time and the generosity that you've given us and our staff, both of you. So if you just join with me and say thank you, I'm going to call on Marek too. Got a present for you. Marek's got a gift for you.
Oh, right. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, cool.
This concludes our event tonight. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and thank you so much, Linda, for your amazing Dean's lecture, and thank you so much, Liz, for your vote of thanks and for reflecting on Linda's and Graham's amazing work that they've done with us here at the Faculty of Education, University of Melbourne. We really hope to see you back soon for the next Dean's public lecture here at the Faculty of Education. Please scan the QR code on the screen to keep being informed about the upcoming education events. And thank you so much for coming, and travel safely back home. Kia ora.